Hey everybody, Kelsie Eckert here. A couple things before we start. This week's episode ran really long, and we decided to keep everything. So this is what is usually the second half of the episode.
Hey Kelsie.
Hey Brooke.
Want to tell everyone what's happening in today's episode?
This episode, we're going to discuss the culture wars and journey back in time to the ultimate culture war, the American frontier.
Oh no. Okay, let's get into this episode.
Hello, and welcome to Remedial Herstory, the other 50%, the podcast that explores what happened to the women in history class. Now, here's your host, Kelsie Brooke Eckert, and her partner in crime, Brooke Neva Sullivan.
Welcome back, everybody. Helen Reddy died this month, Brooke. Do you know who Helen Reddy is?
I sort of do.
She sang the song, I Am Woman.
Oh, great song.
Great song. And they're actually...
Almost a few bars.
Yeah. I don't know if I can right now with my voice as it is. But, so she passed away, and I was listening to her song kind of in honor of her the other day. And one of the lyrics really stood out to me. And she says, if I have to, I can do anything. And I was surprised because this song is like an anthem of... you know, women liberation and whatever.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. That.
Thinking about it.
You got it. But she says, if I have to, I can do anything. And I thought that sort of disclaimer in the beginning is an interesting thing. And it totally rings true for women's history in terms of themes. And so we're going to talk today about the frontier. And it's a really good example where women have to step up. And it's also interesting because the historical record when it comes to women is abundant on the American frontier and American settlers. And I think...
Is that because more women survived the passage?
I don't know that I can make that claim, but I do think it's because women were equally significant.
Yeah, like survival meant both of you had to figure this out.
Yes.
Anyone coming... you're on your own.
Right. And there was no pretense of like, you know, women having special privileges and being dainty and whatever.
But
like
how many movies have we seen where a frilly woman goes out to the West,
right,
can't hack it, and then all of a sudden she's like, you know, wearing pants and has to lasso a cow by herself. And
right.
They're like total transformation. It's like, all right.
Right. The women who
wanted this anymore.
The women who wanted to go out there were total badasses. Yeah. So, in almost every era, the role of women is really and the status of women is really dependent on how quote unquote civilized the society is. And the less civilized, the more power and influence women have in that society. And this is evidenced, you know, when we talked about women's suffrage, like the Western states, the Wild Wild West, gave women the right to vote way before the East, right?
Still blows my mind.
So it's hard to imagine a time when the frontier was like Boston. But yet that's kind of where the European-centric version of American history really begins. Okay. And so that's where I want to sort of begin, even though it's white-centric and European-centric and all those things. Stanford History Education Group has a really awesome lesson plan where it's kind of like data analysis, where you look at the manifests from different ships going to the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Virginia Colony, and you look at the different types of people that are on board those ships. Mm-hmm. And what students should walk away from that lesson with is, on your way to the Virginia Colony, it's predominantly single young men, and on the way to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, it's mostly families. Yep. And there's this huge difference. And I think that culture, like we were talking about culture wars, this culturally sets up for a very different culture in Virginia than in Massachusetts. Very different emphasis on religion in both places. Or
values, culture values.
Yep. Absolutely. So I highly recommend that lesson, and I think it's a really good one in terms of understanding relationships and intimacy and family and women's roles in both of these areas as Europeans are coming over. Let's talk about Virginia kind of briefly here. In the Virginia area, women first come over mostly as wives, and you mentioned this earlier, right? To sort of like settle down the crazy single men that are over there.
Quit drinking, do your farm labor.
do your freaking job.
Have a bunch of babies so no one gets sleep until you're tired and can't revolt.
Exactly. I want to read a little bit to you from the book America's Women by Gail Collins. Because this just like blew my mind. She spends her chapter called The First Colonists, I feel like would be a really good one to have students read for more of like an in-depth view of the era. And I highly recommend it to everybody. But she talks about in 1609, some of the first women come over to the Virginia colony. This is the time in Jamestown that was known as starving time. I don't know if you remember that, but it sounds like a great time.
Great, let me just get on a boat and get on over there.
Starving time.
How lovely.
And actually, I should back up a little bit here because I'm getting ahead of myself. One of the big things is we know that many of the Native American tribes that were present there already were matrilineal, meaning that the inheritance passed down from mother to daughter. So we know that the Hopi, the Iroquois, and the Chickasaw, probably among others, were matrilineal. And in the indigenous tribes, one of the things that was interesting is that control of the food brought power. And since women played a dominant role in the growing and harvesting of crops, which they did have crops. There's a huge myth about, the Europeans bringing agriculture. And so because they did that, they had higher status. And there's a lot of evidence throughout world history that nomadic groups, the women who did all the gathering and did all the agricultural actually provided the vast majority of the food for the tribe. And so for women, that gave them a lot of power. Prior to, this group coming over during starving time, there had been English settlements that had been attempted before. You might remember Roanoke. And on that Roanoke Island, on this settlement that failed, we know there was one woman. Her name was Eleanor Dare, and she gave birth to a Virginia Dare. So the Virginia Dare was the first European American born in the Americas. And so that's interesting. But we also know from history that settlement does not survive. And we actually don't really know what happened to Eleanor Dare or Virginia Dare because when the English returned 3 years later to that island, the people were gone. And it's probably because of conflict with the Native Americans or starving because they were ill-equipped and ill-prepared to be there. And the indigenous folks on the mainland probably, could have potentially brought them in. And that would be a much prettier version than their death and by the Croatan tribe that lived nearby. So the first women to arrive were the wife of Thomas Forrest. We don't know her name. She was Mrs. Forrest, and she had a maid, Anne Burris. Of course, apparently the maid got her name written down in the historical record, but not the master, the mistress. And they're the only women in a colony of about 200 misfits and mercenaries. Sounds like a lovely time.
Misfits and mercenaries. These are my friends.
Yeah.
We're going for starving time.
So she has a baby during starving time, which I can't even imagine what that would be like. Anne Burris, her maid, does survive the winter. In her book, Gail Collins talks about how a lot of what we know about these early Virginia settlers is a little bit extreme because most of the documents that talk about women are court records. And so it's always like these extreme cases that, need to be resolved in court that get discussed. one thing Gail Collins emphasizes in the book a great deal is that there's this huge gap in the number of men and women that there are in the colonies. And so women have this huge advantage because there are fewer of them, and so there's a lot of competition for women. She talks about how women often marry many times because life expectancy is so low, and they immediately get swooped up. And a lot of women actually become kind of wealthy because their husbands keep bequeathing their, so much to them when they pass away. One of the women who is a very early settler in Virginia, her name was Temperance Flowerdew. She ends up marrying multiple governors and actually holds the record of the number of governors that she is married to. We know a little bit about Joan Pierce and her young daughter Jane. They stayed through and survived one of the hungry winters in Jamestown. And Joan ends up returning to England and brags about how she can keep a house in Virginia for £300 or £400 than in London. And her daughter Jane grows up to marry John Rolfe after his wife Pocahontas dies. So we'll talk about Pocahontas really briefly too. Because you got
Disney version or the accurate one?
The accurate one. Pocahontas is written into the historical record by John Smith. And John Smith has a couple different versions of his history, his experiences traveling around Virginia. The first one doesn't mention Pocahontas at all. Pocahontas is captured by the folks in Jamestown, and while in captivity, this is really interesting, she converts to Christianity. She is offered an opportunity to go back to her people, and she declines. One of the things that's really interesting is her father, Powhatan, we do have primary sources from him. He said, he's very critical, obviously, of the people in Jamestown because...
Rightfully so.
Because of all the things that we already know about American history. But he says, why would you take by force what you can have by love? And I thought that was really interesting. Be our friends. We would, I know, right? We would happily share with you. It's interesting because his daughter goes on to marry John Rolfe, who is one of the leaders of the Jamestown colony.
John Smith.
Not John Smith. Disney, not John Smith. I love how John Rolfe in the Disney movie is the dopey guy in the corner.
He's so cute.
He is cute, but he's
friends with Miko.
So,
Cocoa.
Right.
Not that I've watched the movie a few times.
Right. And it's also not super accurate. So anyway, so she marries John Rolfe and she travels back to Europe with him and she becomes super famous. She has her portrait painted and all these things.
The portrait of the huge neck collars.
Yeah, not the skimpy dress that she's wearing in the Disney film.
Pocahontas, if anyone is listening and wants to see the craziest outfits you've ever seen in your life.
I love her top hat.
Top hat.
So she dies in Europe and is buried there. She dies from diseases that she's never been exposed to, like most of the Native Americans.
Smallpox, all the things.
Right. And, but she becomes a sensation. And their marriage is one of the last intermarriages between the white settlers and the indigenous folks.
Wasn't that part of, correct me if I'm wrong, didn't they originally propose, let us give you 12 of our women, you give us 12 of yours, so that we become brothers?
I think that's the intention, is to try to intermarry between these tribes and create peace. People. Because the settlement of Jamestown was incredibly violent in a lot of ways. So she gets married, and it's when she comes over to Europe, she's famous, and that's when John Smith rewrites his story to include her. So a lot of historians
ride on the coattails of famous.
Yeah, a lot of historians don't really buy that she ever saved his life because it's not written in until later. And if that was really what happened, that's an epic story, right? Of her no, father, don't kill him, that whole thing. So yeah.
Yeah, someone else might have covered it.
Yeah. Right. So John Smith's story about her saving his life doesn't really make sense, but she's written into the record. And
how dare you question a white man's history?
Sorry, my bad. So she's interesting, though, because her entire story is told through the eyes of white European men.
So there's no first-hand accounts.
No, from her. We don't have anything. So, and I think that's the story of a lot of the indigenous folk, which is part of the reason why we start U.S. history where we do, unfortunately, is because other than like teaching indigenous traditions and the varying indigenous cultures, it's really hard to start history, which is source-based.
Well, right, and like what indigenous culture do you start with?
Right. I always start by showing my students a map of North America and where all the varying tribes are, because I think
we've talked about this. It's awesome to see where the culture is around your own community and what land you are actually on. It's not Massachusetts, let me tell you.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's interesting. I mean, being one of the women who come over to, and it's interesting that Pocahontas did the reverse journey, you know, but to take that journey, I mean, that's an incredibly dangerous journey.
Not many survive.
No, it took 8 to 12 weeks, which, by the way, the difference between 8 and 12 weeks is an entire month. So, like,
or a whole trimester.
You could run out of food. Right. I mean, there were women who gave birth on the journey. One woman died en route and while giving birth. And so they just like pushed her out a porthole. Like, it's crazy. Women during starving time, like one man ate his wife because like it's horrifying. Well, so those tobacco brides that you were talking about, they are really interesting because they're coming over really like as paid brides, right? To come over.
Right.
They don't know their spouse that they're gonna marry, and they just like hope upon hope that this person is a nice person.
Right, because they responded to like an ad in the paper.
Right.
So like the new colonies the Americas are looking for women, and most of the women that came over had kind of a storied past too.
Yeah. So some of the women were brought over and they were kidnapped and brought over. And yeah, like they're in Europe doing their thing, and next thing they know, they're on a ship being sold into indentured servitude in the Americas. And so that's horrifying as well. And we know that because there are advertisements in newspapers of parents looking for their daughters who've gone missing.
Holy Moses.
Yeah. So I want to finish talking about the Virginia colony by talking about a major historical event that occurred there, which was Biggins Rebellion. And Biggins Rebellion is an event that really brings all of the different cultures and all of the different issues that are going on together. First of all, this is a war between folks that are sort of on the outside of the Jamestown settlement, right on the frontier, that are interacting most with the Native Americans. It's about a war and a conflict there. We're kind of brushing over and not giving a ton of detail on the war that's going on between the folks settling in Jamestown and the indigenous tribes that are there. In 1622, a bunch of women who settled in Jamestown were murdered. We know that 347 settlers lost their lives to a massacre by the Native Americans. We know that those were returned. We know that the folks who settled in Jamestown poisoned an entire tribe within the Powhatan Confederacy. So there's also some kidnapping of young women going back and forth. So, this is pretty terrible. And the Biggins Rebellion is kind of the culmination of this back and forth. Separately, we have, colonial governors whose wives, like Temperance Flowerdew, are coming over. And there's this huge clash and culture conflict between the Jamestown settlers that are settling on the outskirts and the sort of very wealthy Jamestown elite. And so Biggins Rebellion is started by Nathaniel Bacon because the people on the frontier feel like they are not having their interests followed through on. They feel like the governor is not taking seriously the Indian War and is kind of leaving them out to dry out on the frontier. And then they're also growing really upset about the rising elite in Jamestown. I have a lesson plan that I've used for years and years and years that has a bunch of primary source material and looks at varying historical accounts. One sort of favorable to Nathaniel Bacon, another one that's kind of critical of him. And I ask my students to consider, is Nathaniel Bacon a hero or a traitor, or a revolutionary or a traitor? And I thought, wow, this is a really great lesson. And then I read Gail Collins's book, and I realized that yet again, there were women there, and not one of the documents that I included in this lesson plan even mentions women. And I won't read everything to you from her book, but the end of her chapter called The First Colonists ends with a bit about Biggins Rebellion. And first of all, she tells us that frontier wives were frequently left alone, and so they actually were some of the most ardent, sort of like, kill the Indians sort of people, and that's horrible, but yet an important part of the history. And I think, we also need to mention, like, women are on the wrong side of history a lot of times. And certainly these frontier women were pretty aggressive in their hatred of Native Americans. Bacon actually includes them in their leadership, and there's a lot of evidence that women were in sort of like the Situation Room helping to plan the rebellion. And one woman, her name was Sarah Drummond. She, some of the leaders were beginning to kind of doubt the rebellion. She stands up, she snaps a stick in two, and she says, "I fear the power of England no more than a broken straw." Pretty profound statement. So we know that there are women like in the room during leadership and during the planning. We know that some women actually traveled the countryside to rally support for Bacon's rebellion. The other interesting thing is that when Bacon storms Jamestown, the Jamestown elite had left their wives behind, thinking that, like, if by chance Bacon, reaches Jamestown, they're not going to hurt the women. And first of all, Bacon treated women equally, which in war meant that he beat them equally. He actually took some of the most prominent women's, the wives of these, Jamestown elite, and he chained them up around the barricade so that when the Jamestown elite wanted to, like, retake Jamestown, they had to go through their wives. And so obviously they held their fire, and this gave Bacon time to prepare his defenses. So anyway, there's a ton of engagement here by women. They're in the historical record. It's well documented. And yet a lot of the historians don't even mention women there. So I really, I've created another lesson plan now that includes this passage from Gail Collins, and it asks students to consider, why do you think, these women weren't included in all the other documents that you've already read? And, given what you now know about how Bacon treated women, do you think that does that contribute to the question? Is he a traitor or a revolutionary? So I think that's a really cool one.
For lesson plan ideas and how to teach women's history, visit our website, www.remedialherstory.com. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Remedial Herstory. If you think what we're doing is needed, please consider joining our Patreon community. Patreon allows you to sponsor a podcast with a small donation. Patrons get access to bonus materials, extended episodes, insider information, and gear. Patrons who give at the $10 tier will receive a Remedial Herstory sticker. We want to sincerely thank some of our patrons for their contributions. Kent and Jamie Heckel from Ohio have been some of our biggest fans from the beginning. Thank you so much for your contribution. And a huge thank you to Bridget Erlandson from Connecticut. As an educator, your endorsement and passion for equitable education means a great deal. Thank you for your support and endorsement. You can find a link to our Patreon page on our website, www.remedialherstory.com, or you can go to patreon.com and search for Remedial Herstory.
in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the first colonists, the first people that are coming over, and they're changing course mid route. Some people think that they were intended for a island in Maine. Some people think that they intended to end up down in Virginia, but stopped early to sort of found this like Puritan utopia or something. But these people are a mix of religious separatists and Puritans and non-religious people that are just trying to get the heck out of England.
What's a Puritan for the non-Englander?
Puritan is, it's a religious group, and they were not separatists. And so they weren't trying to, like, break away from England, from the Church of England. They are trying to purify the Church of England from within and weed out...
No more sin, no more stealing, no more all the bad.
Right, and they're looking for the devil at every turn because he's very active. Yeah. Yes.
He's within us all.
Right. So the Puritans are important to the story of the Massachusetts Bay Colony because they sort of create the culture of the Massachusetts Bay Colony that will endure for that century. And so backing up a little bit, when the Mayflower, which is the ship that the first group come over on, pulls up to Plymouth Rock, they look out and they see, a village it's a Native American village that is abandoned. And there are all these, homes and grave sites, and the tribe that had lived there had been killed by disease. And so the people on the Mayflower go inland and they basically like rob the graves to get out all the things that they need to survive there. And there were 17 women on board the Mayflower, and we don't have a single document from any of them, but we know that Bradford's wife was on board and she drowned in the harbor when she landed. And some people think that it was a suicide. Like, she looked out on the land and was like, fuck this, I'm done.
I mean, no one would blame her.
Yeah.
Like, imagine coming from a metropolitan place like England.
Right.
Where you have, of the time, all the comforts.
Yeah.
At your access. You have people taking care of you. You know where to get things. You know when your next meal is coming. Mm-hmm. It's relatively cushy, if you will. And you're coming to this land where it's like, there's nothing. And you just see trees and lots of trees and more trees and then more trees. And then there's a whole dead society. Yeah, I think I'm out. Yeah.
So, admittedly, I have really excluded women from my lessons.
Well, you have no first-hand accounts.
Well, we do, though.
Oh.
So this year I changed how I taught the period, and so
you won't tell the AP lady.
No. I mean, I think I taught it better this year. And so I started with John Winthrop, right, who's kind of the voice of Puritan Massachusetts Bay Colony. And I've always started with him. And there's some great lesson plans that are out there about, some of his sermons that he gave early teachings, the City Upon a Hill, right? All those things are wonderful. And so I started with those to really critique the Puritan society. Using women is amazing. And so I just started throwing women's voices out to talk about it. And so the foremost is Anne Hutchinson. Do you know her from your...
I feel like I should, but I don't.
Okay.
Give me, what do you got?
So Anne Hutchinson is a Puritan preachess. What do you call her?
I don't think it's gender.
Okay. Preacher. Great. And she starts preaching, and people come to her, and
Does she wear pants?
She does not wear pants. She wears the outfit you described as your Halloween costume or whatever you wore it for.
Don't knock the aprons and the socks.
Sure.
And the jeans. It was pretty classy in 3rd grade.
So she's incredible. And they have paintings of her preaching to mixed audiences where men are in the room.
What?
And the Puritan society puts her on trial and they expel her from.
Obviously, she's a witch.
Right. No, they don't accuse her of being a witch, but they accuse her of being improper and of being too critical of the church. And this is, so she is really pushing back against the theocracy that's really taking place, right? Where you have a government, a religious government.
Right.
And she pushes back, and she pushes too far. And so they banish her from the Massachusetts Bay Colony.
Where do you go at that point?
Yeah, so she ends up in New Amsterdam, which is like modern-day New York. And she and her family are massacred by Native Americans there. And that's like her sad ending.
Yikes.
Yeah, rough story for Anne. And so it's a really interesting like demonstration of the intolerance that the Puritans have for
like either step in line or get out.
Right. And here's a woman who's sort of challenging not only the church but challenging gender norms.
And she could read.
And she can read that Bible.
I mean, she came to play.
Yeah. So she's really, really interesting. Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote a book that a lot of people know, and I'm sure you do as an English major, Scarlet Letter. Nathaniel Hawthorne actually died in our town. Did you know that?
In Plymouth.
In Plymouth, New Hampshire.
Interesting.
There's a plaque in the...
There's a lot of plaques around here.
You read them all, right?
You point it out next time.
Okay.
It's like one every half mile.
So the Scarlet Letter is American literature. It's not accurate necessarily, but it's based, it's written in the 1850s, and it's based on Puritan Massachusetts Bay Colony. And it's about, the main character is Hester Prynne.
Yes.
And she commits adultery and basically is scorned by the society. She's forced to wear a red A for adulteress on her dresses, on her gowns, everywhere she goes.
If you would like a today version of this, there is a movie called The Letter A or something.
Oh, really?
With Emma Stone.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
They go real in depth on the Scarlet Letter in the movie.
Oh, interesting. So it's a really great example of sort of the norms and the sexual standards. And it was the other day, I was doing my research for my class, and I stumbled upon a real life version of Hester Prynne. Yeah.
Bring it.
So this is actually from...
Please give the title of this book.
Oh, this book is Crime and Punishment, the Colonial Period to the New Frontier.
And it's this really skinny little purple book that Kelsie is holding up. When you give that title, it should be as thick as the American history book that my microphone is taking.
Well, they're focusing on the colonial period. Okay. So this is actually from John Winthrop's journal. So that's why I think it's great to start with him, because he is the primary account for most of the stories of women from this time. So there's a court trial because one James Britton, a man ill affected both to our church discipline and civil government, and one Mary Latham, a proper young woman about 18 years of age, whose father was a godly man and had brought her up well, they were condemned to die for adultery upon a law formally made and published in print. It was thus occasioned and discovered. This woman, being rejected by a young man whom she had affection unto, vowed she would marry the next that came to her. She matched with an ancient man who had neither honesty nor ability, and one whom she had no affection unto. So she marries...
I'm sorry. Back then, you need protection and shelter as a woman. Yeah, you're gonna marry a man who's ill?
Sure. Yeah.
Take me in, sir. I have no home. I can own no property. Otherwise, they're gonna ship me back on that crazy boat for 18 weeks. Like, hell's... Yeah.
12. Let's not exaggerate.
Okay. Well, where's the next farmer boy? Are you 14? Let's get married.
Let's get married. Let's do this.
Back on that boat.
So she's solicited. They solicited her chastity, is what he says.
Oh, man.
And they draw her into bad company, so he says. Giving her wine and other gifts easily prevailed with her, and among others, this Briton.
Well, I mean, girls are dumb. Of course they'll be solicited by wine and good gifts.
Right, duh.
Duh.
So she confessed that he did attempt the fact, but did not commit it. Then Britain and the woman were seen upon the ground together a little from the house. It was reported also that she did frequently abuse her husband, setting a knife to his breast and threatening to kill him, calling him an old rogue and a cuckold.
Okay, Kelsie, take a seat.
Sorry.
Very aggressive.
I know, but Winthrop is also getting a little aggressive. I don't really buy half of this.
It's very dramatic.
Very dramatic. So there were not two direct witnesses, but the jury cast her, and then she confessed to the fact. Ladies, life lesson, don't confess if they don't have enough evidence.
I mean, that's the life lesson to anyone.
Right.
If they don't have evidence, deny, deny, deny.
Yeah. I don't know what you're talking about.
I'm sorry, who? What?
The woman proved very penitent and had deep appreciation of the foulness of her sin, and at length attained to hope of pardon by the blood of Christ, and was willing to die in satisfaction to justice. This Briton had been a professor in England, but coming hither he opposed our church government, etc. They were both executed.
What?
Yeah.
You don't have a lot of bodies to begin with, Winthrop. You can't just be executing people for sex.
Right. So she died.
And we're done with that chapter.
And we're done with her. No, it's horrible. So in Puritan society, basically,
You're really beating up.
well, it's just like what these laws are, so, like, you know, like people cheat on.
You would see a woman, though, similar to you, get killed and executed for sex, you'd be like, so deny? We're all gonna deny.
We're all denying now.
Next sewing circle, everyone agree?
Sewing circle.
Well, what else did they do back then? I don't know. Like knitting circle and Bible reading. If you're not doing that, you're getting up early to bake bread.
Okay. Of course, you cannot teach about the Massachusetts Bay Colony without teaching about the Salem witch trials.
I mean, exactly. You have to go in.
So what I recently realized is that the witch craze that's going on in Germany slowly spreads to England.
Yeah.
And in England, it's the Puritans as well that are the primary proponents of the witch trials that are happening there.
Yes.
And in almost all the cases, the majority of the witches that are accused are women. And
there are some men.
There are some men.
Don't want to leave them out.
Nope.
They were also at the stake.
Right. But of, the majority of people are women, and these people are oftentimes either women who, shunned sexual advances from a man, and so he accuses her of witchcraft. A lot of times, though, they're like older women or women who know stuff about birth control, medicinal properties.
There's a lot of midwives that are
accused
because they know about all of those things, and they know a lot more about the community than they should.
Right. And then some of the other people are, just like outcasts and disabled people and like really mentally ill, people who don't live in the center of town and live on the outside. So the Salem witch trials in Massachusetts Bay Colony are a really good example. There are 20 people that are eventually executed, and 15 of those 20 are women. And it's one of those things that dies out really quickly. And in American history, the Salem witch trials really stand out when we talk about founding documents because it really influences people's thinking about innocent until proven guilty.
It's kind of like that first account where you can really dig into the American justice system and how they're trying to interpret the law and what they're using and how they're using it.
Yeah.
And like just the manipulation tactics and the jury, rigging. It's very interesting. Yeah. And I think it just goes to show like how when you look at the history from the women's perspective, you can sort of like see all the different, like it's almost like you can start to question and ask, like the inquiry sort of like speaks for itself because it's like, well, wait, why is this happening? And it's happening because they're not like they're going off of religious doctrine about the devil. And I think something too you're leaving out is a lot of women accused each other. Yes. It wasn't just these like it was, especially in the Salem witch trials, it was mostly women accusing other women. Right. Because they didn't like the way that they were the most beautiful in town or that they were getting the most attention from their local government and church. It's like there was a lot. Right. Or they were wealthier or they had more land. They had more land. There was a lot about land. Yeah. Yeah. So the other thing that I learned recently as I'm doing more research about the Puritans is that they are constantly expelling people that are not Puritans. Right.
the Quakers come over and predominantly settle near New York. And one woman named Mary Dyer came to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and she came with a group of people. She was, people who came that were not Puritans were sometimes flogged, they were branded, their ears were cropped. Like, these are
the appropriate welcoming.
Right.
Any other.
Right. Like, what a foundation for our country. So Quakers often come to Rhode Island because it's like the only place that's kind of like open and like accepting. Roger Williams is there, and he had decreed complete religious freedom. So they end up there. In 1658, Massachusetts Governor John Endicott passed a law banishing all Friends, aka Quakers, from the colony on pain of death. So if you come in, we will kill you, is sort of like the decree. And so
I can't. My eyes just rolled back in my head. I had to cough.
So Quakers come to sort of challenge this law. Like, this is not okay. This is intolerant. And William Robinson, Marmaduke Stevenson, that's a name.
Flawless name.
Mary Dyer, and an 11-year-old Patience Scott, all of whom go to Boston. So they head up to Boston to sort of like push back against this Puritan law. And they are tried. The child is considered too young to be punished, so she's excused. But all of them were banished by the general court. So they leave and they go to Rhode Island. But in 1659, they come back, where they were sentenced to death. So Mary Dyer is up on the scaffold. She's with these two guys. The two guys hang next to her, and they pardon her because she's a woman, and they don't kill her.
What?
So she leaves, and then she comes back, as you do.
Like, girl, take your chips and run.
Right. She said she had movings from the Lord to go to Boston, and there she came the 21st of the 3rd month, 1660. And she was tried. And the governor said, "Are ye the same Mary Dyer that was here before?" And she was like, "Yep."
I wish she was like, "Yep, bitch, I'm back."
So they take her and they hang her. And
oh my God.
She says, "I came in obedience to the will of God, the last general court, desiring you repeal your unrighteous laws of banishment upon pain of death, and that shame is my work now." And that same is my work now. So, John Endicott asked her if she was a prophet, and she said, "And now the thing is come to pass." What an answer.
It's like ominous.
But so it was really interesting teaching about these women that are on the frontier. You've got Pocahontas, who's trying to find peace with Jamestown by intermarrying and figuring that out. Yep. You've got women that are being written about by the most prominent men of the era. Yeah. And one of the things that's really interesting about the Massachusetts area is that in this area, women are educated.
Right. Because
they have so much emphasis on reading the Bible that it's really important that all the kids can read. Right. And so education's super important. And women are, because of the demands, women are working jobs right next to men.
Right, they're farming, they're building houses,
some
they're
women,
raising barns.
Some women are actually making more money than their spouse because of the work that they do. And they have very gendered roles that they're dealing with, but women are contributing, they're earning money outside the home. And, in her book, Gail Collins writes about how, like, these women's granddaughters would be mortified at the things that their grandmothers and great-grandmothers did because they're being, they're out just working and tilling the land and doing whatever the heck needs to be done.
Well, yeah, they're contributing to that.
So in the midst of all of this, they're also they're not only are they dealing with the sort of like internal, like, we have all these very strict rules, do not deviate, right, lest you die.
Bible is law.
Right. So in addition to that, they're also dealing with the threat of Native Americans around them. And
just that little.
Students of history should know about King Philip's War, which is a war that is between the Native Americans and like a kind of a confederacy of Native Americans against the European settlers that are there. The Stanford History Education Group actually has a really awesome lesson plan on King Philip's War. I don't like calling it King Philip's War because King Philip was sort of a mocking name given to Metacomet, who was leading the Wampanoag resistance against the English settlers who were sort of walking all over the Native Americans who had been trying to create peace for a long time. So I really like this lesson plan. They give you the colonist perspective, they give you Metacomet's perspective, but I recently learned about Weetamoo. Weetamoo was a sachem, a Wampanoag sachem, who was actually married 4 times, kind of similar to the European women, right? There's a really high death rate of people, and so she actually marries 4 times, and her various marriages help to unite the Wampanoag Confederacy, and she is actually super influential in the war, and she even divorces her husband, or rather dissolves her marriage, because her husband, this is her 4th husband, I should say, he supports the English. He takes his tribe and he supports the English, and so she takes her followers and goes with Metacomet, and Metacomet, her sister is like married into his group, so she's very, very loyal to him, and she puts the full weight of her tribes against the English along with Metacomet. And in the midst of these wars, she is raiding villages and kidnapping people to trade back for ransom and peace and things like that. We actually have a primary source from a white woman who was captured by Weetamoo, and she's one of the only primary sources of this incredible indigenous woman. And so that's kind of a neat bit of history. That primary source is up on our website. And she ends up crossing a river to flee, to get away from the English soldiers, away from the redcoats, and she drowns in the river. And the English find her body and chop her head off and put it on a spike outside the village. And there's a bunch of natives that were in the village being held captive, and when they saw her head, apparently they were just like wailing in grief. So I have the Stanford History Education Group lesson plan, and then what I've done is I've added onto it, and I have this account about Weetamoo, and I ask, similar to the Biggins Rebellion, like, why the heck is this woman's story not included? Because she is the political power behind Metacomet's movement, behind this war. This war, by the way, is incredibly consequential. 5% of the New England population dies in this war. That's more than World War II. The English, the Germans, the Americans, nobody lost 5% of their total population. So this is an incredible war, and at the end of it, I mean, basically the Native Americans are pushed out. And there's another really interesting story, sort of in the aftermath. The Avenaki, who are kind of in New Hampshire, actually, the Avenaki are this tribe, and they are, sort of without good standing, good position, and so they begin sort of raiding villages and trading people back, and they happen to kidnap a woman named Hannah Dustin. Cotton Mather, another Puritan voice from history.
Cotton Mather in your class?
Right, not very big. So he's the main primary source for her story. In fact, he's the only source, which is really unfortunate because I would really, really, really love to hear the Native American version of this story.
I'm imagining we can interpret it.
So Native Americans are basically expelled from the Massachusetts area as a result of King Philip's War.
Not welcomed in and invited to the table?
No, Thanksgiving is a lie. So,
Kelsie, no.
Sorry, we'll get there. So he frequently, in all of his writings about Native Americans, portrays them as instruments used by the devil. Very Puritan, as you will.
I mean, that's so aggressive, but okay.
Right. So by the late 1680s, at the start of King William's War, a bunch of the tribes that are left are basically just like raiding villages and stealing people and then selling them back for ransom and that type of thing.
Sounds like a great time.
So Hannah Dustin is among them. And so she gets kidnapped by the Native Americans.
How old is she?
She's 40 but when they kidnap her. And
She's 40?
She gave birth.
Like old age.
She gave birth a week before. And so she
40?
Yeah, so she has a 1-week-old baby and she's captured by Native Americans. They put her in boats, canoes, and they take her up the river into New Hampshire. And so here in New Hampshire, about 40 minutes from where you and I are right now, on an island, asleep at night with the Native Americans, and she gets a hold of a hatchet.
Oh.
And she kills them all.
Is
Apparently,
this the first murder story in history?
no, but apparently they had killed her baby like days before because the baby was holding them up, right? So they kill her baby, and who knows if that's true? That might have been exaggerated in the sort of like Puritan version of the story. So she murders them all, gets in the boat, and goes home. And so there's a statue to her. And I've always thought about this as a really interesting story about, like, okay, here's a woman defending herself. Here's a woman being captured, right, and defending herself. But here's also a woman who massacred a group of Native Americans in the middle of the night. Right? She's a really complicated story. And there's a statue to her here in New Hampshire. That is really interesting. Mather's account obviously stresses the savagery of her Indian captors and provides a horrific description of the murder of her child, where they, quote, dashed out the brains of the infants against a tree.
Too much censor. Sorry.
And, but we won't ever really know what really happened there because we're only here, there's only one version of the story.
What if we did the exact same thing to the Native Americans? What if we captured a woman of theirs and killed a baby of theirs?
Right.
This was retaliation.
Right. Right.
We'll never know.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so she's obviously a very interesting woman on the frontier whose name gets documented and written down in history. But even on the normal themes of U.S. history, I just loved rethinking about Puritan society and the Virginia Bay colony, the Virginia colony from the perspective of women, because it's all there. Religious freedom is there. Innocent until proven guilty is there. Like how do we deal with the Native Americans and what sort of conflicts are going to arise as a result? And there are all these accounts of women that, like, honestly, I really didn't even have to look far to find them.
No, they're right there in the text, which is awesome.
Yeah.
We should talk about them more.
Yeah, it was really cool. So I think that, when we talk about culture wars, this is Mary Dyer really hits home the culture war, right?
Obviously.
Like Puritan or religious freedom, and what's the deal? So it's pretty cool. These ladies.
I loved this. This was fun.
Brooke, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Kelsey. I'm Brooke Sullivan.
I'm Kelsie Eckert.
See you next time.
Thanks so much for listening to Remedial Herstory, the other 50%. Please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts to bring more voices to the conversation. We really appreciate that effort. Until next time.